Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Streamer Time with Scott Biron. My name is Jim Schottenham, curator here at the American Museum of Fly Fishing. Today, we're coming to you from the Selch Backman Fly Room, which is very fitting. And of course, I'm joined by Scott Biron. Scott, of course, is an ambassador for the museum. He's also on the HMH Pro staff and also has a line of feathers through Ewing Hackle. Is that correct?
Yep, Ewing Featherbirds. Yep.
What is it about the feathers from Ewing that makes them?
So the cool thing is that we're able to, I get them dyed, the colors, some of the color dyeing from years and years ago of the flies that were particularly the Carrie Stevens line and all those different flies. The colors were hard to go by. People just didn't want those colors. They wanted the new version. So we've brought back some colors that you can't readily get, and now you can. So it's been kind of fun to do that. And the shape, the thickness of the stem, which all matters for how the fly actually fishes.
So when talking about a classic pattern, like we're going to be talking about today, the Colonel Bates fly that was created by Carrie Stevens, if you wanted to recreate that fly, it's important to have materials that match up to colors that she would have used.
Right. These are pretty common colors, but there are colors that you use that might have been a reddish orange, or the article that was in the last journal about the controversy of the different colors of the gray ghost. So you try to get as close as you can.
Sure. So as I just mentioned, we're going to be talking today about the Colonel Bates fly that was produced by Carrie Stevens. So let's start by giving a little background on Carrie Stevens.
So Carrie Stevens was a fly dresser up in the Rangeley area. Her husband was a guide, and she was, kind of put the streamers in America on the map. She tied mostly originally featherwing streamers, which is what we're going to be doing today, which is the rooster feathers and different materials to combine that were imitating smelt and bait fish.
Okay.
And she pretty much created mass of them, upwards of probably 90 plus that we know of right now. And they're all really, really effective.
So there was some talk, and I think we have some exciting paperwork here, but there was talk for a time that Carrie Stevens actually invented the streamer fly.
Yeah, and you go back and say that there were streamers in England and overseas, and they actually, sometimes there's some people that believe they called hackle feathers streamers, just the feather itself. But what she did was she perfected the streamer as we know it today, pretty much the casting and trolling streamers that were so popular back in the Rangeley area, and morphed out of that. Tires, different great tires came along and had their own version, perfecting it and changing it. Materials changed. Jim Warner introduced flash into his streamers. So she really kind of like laid the groundwork here in the United States.
Sure. But what we've discovered, thanks to an original letter from the collection of Pam Bates, she was kind enough to share with Scott and I in the museum a letter written to Colonel Bates from Carrie Stevens. And it's incredibly important in that it talks about the origin of the streamer fly in Maine,
right?
Very, very clearly,
right.
And in fact, she gives credit to someone that I think most historians, tackle historians, fly tyers may or may not be familiar with. But I think
Shang Wheeler.
Yeah.
Yes, from Connecticut. He was Carrie's husband Wallace was a guide for him, and he became very friendly with the family, and he really encouraged her to tie these flies and tie streamers. And she wanted to get the record rate, and Pam Bates was nice enough to provide us with these letters that we could clearly read that Carrie had written in response to an article that Pam's father, Colonel Bates, was writing about flies, and she wanted to set the record straight. And
Yeah.
you know, it was today. Somebody else might take credit for that, but she wanted to make sure that he knew that it really was, you know, from Shang's encouragement that she went that way.
Yeah, also interesting that Shang, of course, did not want any part of the credit that he was due. But Carrie, to her credit, was adamant in the letter that she wrote to Colonel Bates about a pending article in National Sportsman uh, giving full credit to Shang, that she wanted to make sure that the record was set straight, not only about the origin of her streamers. She talked about the successes that they had, talked about some of the wonderful catches that they had at Upper Dam. And it's just a remarkable document that clearly points to the origin of her streamer time.
Right.
So she was augmenting something that Shang had given her and improved on it, of course, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Right. Exactly.
So she clearly had a really good relationship with Colonel Bates, and in fact,
well, actually, it started as Captain Bates, and this was what Pam Bates. She chuckled when she said this to me, and she said the joke was, as my rank goes up, are you going to change the name of the fly? And of course, Carrie said, yes, I will. And it started as the Captain Bates, went to the Major Bates, and then went to the Colonel Bates without really a material change.
okay.
And I asked her, because what I was curious was, I asked Pam, did your father ask Carrie to guide a fly and name it for him? And she said, no, Carrie developed the fly and named it after my dad. And that's consistent with what she did. She named a lot of flies after friends and people, her dog and whatnot. But it was kind of I got a lot of kind of interesting feedback from Pam when I was talking with her. It was wonderful. 2 times that we spoke on the phone, and it was great.
Yeah, I mean, the letter is just fantastic. It's truly historical in terms of documenting the history of these flies. And then, of course, there's some other history between Colonel Bates and Carrie Stevens.
Right. So what's kind of interesting with Bates, he pretty much wrote the first book that put streamer and bucktail, and this is a newer edition of it. I've got all the editions, but in this one, he puts the recipe down and talks about the tail is small section of red duck or swan wing. So this is your red duck right here, but this is not very durable. This, if anything, is the first thing that's going to go on the fly. And then when the Hilliards came out with their book, which is, you know, really focuses down on Carrie Stevens and her evolution with flies and whatnot, their recipe for it calls for red hackle for the tail. And they obviously saw a lot of the fly patterns as they went through the evolution. She wasn't, she was very practical, right? I would say a good Yankee, and probably realized that the durability of her pattern was better with the hackle, and she moved into that and used that.
So that would explain the discrepancy in the flies versus what was written as a recipe. If she didn't have a particular material, being resourceful, she would use something that was close.
She could have subbed the material. You know, the bellies went from white goat to bucktail depending upon what she had. You know, she was always the gray ghost wing color, like I mentioned before, was always you know, she was looking for a certain color, but if it couldn't get dyed, she took what was, you know, the next best thing. So but you know, I think that we're going to tie it using the Hilliard's recipe. It's a interesting fly because I have tied it in a 10x long, 9x long streamer to troll, but I find that it's much more effective as a casting streamer tied smaller. And in Bates' book, there are two individuals in that book, one fellow from Andover, Mass, that talks about tying it down to a size 14, obviously probably in a 4X hook, and just the success he had. That was his number one fly.
Okay.
I've had tremendous luck with it in a 5 to 7X for brook trout and salmon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, all right. Well, I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and switch up the cameras here so everyone can see what you're tying up.
Yeah. So
And, take it away, Scott.
yeah. So thank you, Jim. And these are always fun to do because sometimes we know so much information on these flies and on the history of them, and every once in a while somebody will have something that updates what we know or adds to what we know, and so it's really kind of a cool thing to get these things out and discuss them. And we have I don't know if you can you show the picture of the one we have in the collection?
Yeah. So let's see if I can't easily get that pulled up for us.
We got a nice gift here at the museum last spring from a woman named Polly Damon, and she owned a fly shop in Aquasic, and she had this really cool, if we can show it, it was a series of flies that were tied by Carrie Stevens, but they had been all fished, and heavily fished, in matter of fact, to the point where some of them were difficult to identify. But there is a Colonel Bates in there. There's also a Mickey Finn that she tied, which is kind of interesting. You don't see too many of those. A couple bucktails, FRS special bucktails. And so we had some fun going through those, but there definitely was a Colonel Bates in there. Well, maybe we can't show it. We can talk about it.
We'll get the photo posted up on the website so that when you if you wanted to watch the webinar later, we'll have that photo available.
So this has a tag of silver tinsel, and all I do is get like a 3-turn wrap. She was probably using that. She was definitely using metal tinsel. I'm using Mylar. I will do construction a little. Remember when she tied, she didn't tie with a vise, and I am. I've done some flies without a vise, and if you ever want to learn anything about vices, there's a great webinar that we did on vices, and we talked a little bit about even through the 1950s, the English Hardy House fly tying people were all still tying in hand. And that's how they apprenticed. That's how they learned, and they stuck with that. So I put a little bit of hackle fibers there on the back. Red always has a unique ability to get fish focused on a fly or a fly pattern. A lot of the original smelt patterns would have a white throat and a white belly, because on smelt, that's what you see. And then fly tyers enhance those patterns, and they enhance them by adding a red throat. Some fly tyers would actually take a red throat and give you an upper red throat and a lower red throat, almost like what commonly would be referred to as a hot spot in on a nymph or whatnot. And it just was a trigger that salmon or different species of trout would go after. A lot of times we find in fishing and in trolling in particularly, the salmon will come around and they'll hit the fly, and I'll often hit it in the front. They won't set the hook, and they kind of try to injure the smelt, and then they go back, circle around back, and they hit the fly and take the hook. They're very opportunistic.
Scott, what are you applying on the thread right
So this is brushing lacquer, but it's what people commonly refer to as head cement. But I use brushing lacquer. The English, they use varnish. And the body is solid silver, overlapped. The lacquer is going to allow this body to really become durable. I don't know if Carrie would have lacquered her metal tinsel. I don't know if she lacquered it down. That would be a question to ask Leslie Hilliard. I know that the flies that we got in the museum collection from Polly Damon, some people would lacquer their bodies after they wrap them. So once I tie this off, they would lacquer their metal tinsel, and it would keep the tinsel from tarnishing. I lacquer a lot of my bodies after I apply them. It just gives them a little bit more durability. The last thing you want is to have the thing fall apart after one fish. So I like to hear people say, "Oh, I caught 35 fly. I caught 35 fish with your fly." So we have a tail and we have the body. I just do a quick 2-turn whip finish to make sure it doesn't come apart. Just a little security whip finish, and I use white thread. The head on this fly is going to have red. Is going to be red, and I'll switch to red. Now the throat on this, there's really no belly on this. The throat on this is brown, and I use hen because it's softer and it gives a little bit more motion. And basically what I do is I put like 4 small tufts of the hen in place. They're really small. And what I'm doing is kind of covering the entire from 3 o'clock down to 6, and then up to 9. So the whole bottom of the fly is covered, the throat. There you have it. And it just gives you a nice solid throat there. And at this point, I can introduce the red thread and use the red thread for my wings. Now, at this point, Carrie Stevens would have probably had her wings already built. I think from what I can figure out, she and what the Hilliards did in their research, she would have built her wings. And this fly calls for yellow, 2 yellow, 1 on the right, 1 on the left. So you take 1 from one side of the saddle here. And if you take them from about the same spot, they're usually have the same profile. And then we get white. We do the same thing. Now the white is, when it's put on, it's slightly shorter than the yellow. So we can sometimes source one here that's a little bit shorter than the yellow. Take 1 from the right, 1 from the left. And like I said, these are bred pretty much for fly time. So the birds are Here we go. And then it's just a matter of how long you want your wing. A lot of Carrie Stevens wings were pretty long. And today I kind of keep mine a little bit on the short side, and mostly because I don't want the wing to foul. And what I mean by that is, I'll show you here. What I don't want, if you have a really long wing and you're casting, that wing can foul underneath the hook. What I want is them just to come right about to a smidge beyond the bend of the where the tail ends. And what I do is I get one, and that one becomes my template. So I'll take the other yellow one and I'll size that one right up. And it looks like it's a lot of work, but if I wasn't talking and doing this on camera, it moves right along. People will say to me, boy, you really can do those quickly. You just get into a rhythm on it, and you're able to kind of move right along. So it doesn't, although it looks like it's a big project, it doesn't really take that long. And then what I do is, we know the white wants to be slightly shorter. So I'm just gonna line the white one up here. So it's just a little bit shorter. Yeah, I don't know if you can see that, but you can see that white one. The white one's behind the yellow one right now, but that's only for me to size it up. It's actually gonna be, the white one's gonna be in the outside. You know, one thing about white and yellow. Yellow is a great pattern for bait fish in the fall. There are some really old fly patterns that contain yellow and that are very effective. You know, do you see yellow bait fish? No, but when you get the white, the yellow, the brown, and the red color all together, it gives you a different color in the water, and it's really effective. I had a day on a trout pond up in the Rangeley area using this fly this spring, and it was just nonstop brook trout, and we were just surprised. Okay, so what I use is a little of this fabric fusion, and I put a really small bit of the fabric fusion right along on the stem. I try not to get too much of it on the barbules of the hackle, and then I lay the white one just slightly shorter right on top of it. And I do that for both of them. Now, fabric fusion was not available when Carrie Stevens was dying. She would use some type of thickened head cement, varnish, lacquer, not exactly sure what. She was kind of private with what she did with her tying. So this is for modern. This works fine. It's waterproof and it dries fairly quickly. So we're gonna mount the wings. She mounted her wings slightly different than most people. She put her wings slightly on the side of the hook. She was using probably a Alcock 1810 hook. They're similar in size to this one, a slightly different bend. This has a Limerick bend. Alcock went out of business right around the war, World War II, and in England, all the hook makers were actually needle makers. They were needle makers in the Redditch, England area, and Alcock being the biggest. And they were asked to make armaments for the war. And every one of the hook makers went out of business after the war. They didn't come back and make anything, and except for Partridge. Partridge was the only one that came back. And so what I do is I lay a nice base down here to mount the wings, and then I put a little wax on it, and the wax will hopefully help here. Well, it looks like this thread has got a little bit of so let me fix this and show you. You got to learn how to fix everything as a fly tie. I'm just going to put a little, so this has got a little bit of a burr in it. Take it out. Put that.
What problems would that burr cause?
So it's it started to fray. And once it does, it's going to thin the thread down. And so when you start to tie with it, it could break on you. So I'm going to mount the wing that's closest to you on first. There it is right there. And then I'm going to mount the second one, my side, on second. And her flies, just get this little bit in place there. And what you notice with her flies is that her wings will cover the body of the fly. Really makes it have a lot of unique action in the water. It gives it the ability to move around in the back, and it's solid in the front, which is exactly what a smelt looks like in the water. It's moving all around, but it's the tail, kind of like when we did the 9-3, where we had the wing being flat on one side, and then the lower part was flat and the top was traditional. That top part moved back and forth, makes it really look like a live fish in the water, which is what you want. And it's got a shoulder, and the shoulder is light gray mallard. And the shoulder on these, if you look at them on many of her patterns, it's almost about halfway down the wing, which is what this is looking like. And then the last part is the jungle foot. And she would have added that. Probably she would have glued her jungle clock for the most part to the shoulder before she put it on. Remember, she didn't have a vise. So she would try to assemble as much of the materials as she possibly could off before she brought them in place. So she was minimizing the number of wraps she did. She was using probably thicker thread. When she sold her business to Wendell Folkens from Tamworth, New Hampshire, he wrote, and we have a copy of him writing to the Hilliards about him tying her flies. And his comment was, I don't know how she makes any money. I'm paraphrasing, but I don't know how she makes any money tying her flies, because they're very labor intensive, very hard to for a production type tire who is trying to make some money to actually reproduce them. And so all in all, it's her methods work for her. And it's one of those things where you got to kind of modernize the vise. When the vise was introduced, it obviously made fly tires' lives a lot easier. In the United States, we grasped right to those vices. In England, they still didn't jump on the vise. They waited because they were all trained through apprenticeships to tie in hand. And it was much easier for them to learn that way. Sometimes unlearning is the hardest thing. But I would imagine that once the vise became readily available and somebody took a hold of that vise and started to see how quickly they could tie, how much more efficient they could do it, they went for it. And I would imagine maybe possibly that if Carrie Stevens had lived longer, I don't know, maybe she would have at least experimented with it, maybe not. Fly tires are funny. They get into a routine, they do it one way, and they go with that. All right, so Carrie Stevens, this fly would have had a black band. Now, that was her signature. It's not mine, so I don't reproduce that black band on the fly. I leave that was her bit. So we leave it like that and let her have the band. I'm just going to use the red head. What I like to do when I whip finish my head is I counterclockwise spin my thread. And this is Danville 6/0 Flymaster. And when I do that, I open up the thread and it allows me to do a nice smooth whip finish. And it kind of takes the little bit of thread coiling look out of the head. And you get a nice little. And then I go through this process of lacquering it. So I use a real thin lacquer that's been cut down with some varnish or lacquer thinner. And that'll suck right in. That'll go right into the head, right down to where all those stems were, making it really durable. And then I'll put another coat of the thin on, and then I have like a thicker. You can't really see here, but it's a little yellower. It's definitely thicker, and what it'll do is it'll build up and give you that glossy look. So I have in a frame here. And I'm going to just whip it out of the frame because you won't see the glass. But I have tied the Colonel Bates, and if you look at it, you'll see here's the finished one right there. And you can see how shiny that head is. And that's after multiple coats. And years after that Colonel Bates came out, there was a fly tire from England, from Europe, called Jimmy Younger. And he came out with a Atlantic salmon pattern of the Colonel Bates. And in the salmon patterns, after Colonel Bates died, Pam put the book together. It was all but done, but she needed to get all sorts of things done and write parts of it and whatnot. And there's a page of all these really great fly tires that tied the Atlantic salmon version. And this is just one of them. And it's got the yellow wing, the rooster feather. It's got the white in there, and then it's got the swan or the goose that's married, red, yellow, red, and it's got some materials that are really unique in there, and it's tied on a hook, Atlantic salmon hook. Got the brown collar with some guinea. It's also got the topping of the golden pheasant that meets the tail. If I stop pulling around with it, it meets the tail. So it's really good. It's a great little fly. This now is ready for me to put another coat of the lacquer on, and I'll put a coat of the thick stuff just so it gives you the idea of what it looks like. And if you look at this now at the fly, you're going to see, if you look at the back where that red tail is, get a little blending in there. When that gets wet, and particularly you can see it on this one that's already done, kind of bleed, it looks like it's bled in there. And that coloring there almost gives you the sense that this fly is, when you fish it, it's been injured. And that's a real big trigger for trout and salmon. They're gonna, somehow I think they know how many calories they burn to get a fish and food. And they kind of figure out in their mind, I'm not gonna waste a lot of calories to get a little bit of calories. So if they know that there's something injured, they can just hit it. They're not gonna have to work too hard for it. I think that kind of is an attractor for them. And I think that red tail makes a big difference. The brown also, when this fly gets wet, it really slims right down. That profile gets slimmed right down, and it makes it a really good fly to fish. Now, this is a 7X hook, 6X hook, 5X hook, depending upon the hook manufacturer. Now you can drop this thing down maybe 1/3 smaller and go to a 4X hook. All your materials get smaller, but you still keep the same coloring. That gets you almost down base size, minnow type. And this coloring really is really unique, and it makes it really look like an attractive pattern that trout and salmon like. The gray mallard is unique. It's got such coloring to it that it looks like the gill plate and everything of the fish. And when it gets wet here, these shoulders kind of just envelop right around the whole fly, and it makes it really look like it's like when I described at the beginning how she goes on either side of the hook as opposed to being right on top. It really holds it and makes that fly really firm in the front and allows the back to really move. Kind of a uniqueness. If you tie these, or you are trying to tie these and you learn how to tie them, tie one in with the wings on top and then tie one with the wings on the bottom, just as an experiment, and fish them. And you'll be surprised at how much more the ones with the wings on the side look like a actual minnow or bait fish or smelt. It's much more effective in my opinion. So there's your Captain Bates, Major Bates, Colonel Bates. As he went up in rank, his fly went up and became much more elaborate with the ranking. He wanted to make sure that Pam said, are you gonna, when I get a promotion, are you gonna make sure? And certainly Carrie did. It's obvious from her letters to him wanting everything to be correct. She wanted to be correct. And we have other letters that Pam sent us that were communication back and forth. And she was always making sure everything was correct. And that is really a tribute to her. It obviously gives you a peek into what type of person she must have been.
So it's interesting, and some of the things I took away from what you were talking about. Obviously, the action of the fly in the water is very important. She obviously spent a tremendous amount of time not only developing the fly, but fishing the fly.
Yeah, and her husband being a guide, I'm certain that he would be able to give her feedback. And the early patterns had not as much feathers on top, one per side, and the bucktail would invert, the fly would go upside down, and he was able to communicate that to her. And then she added more feathers to the top to make it ride the way she wanted to. And some of this early on was probably, just learning and getting feedback, and having Shang probably come in and say, you know what, I've tried a grizzly feather here, and she was willing to do that. And they've stood these flies have stood the test of time. I mean, we're talking about things that were, her gray ghost was 100 years, is 100 years old. So we're talking about flies that have been effective for 100 years. It's pretty good record to
I would
hang your hat
agree.
with. Yeah.
So I noticed too that you talk about not putting her signature band on the head. So of course there are some ways to identify the flies that were tied by Carrie, but we also learned early on that sometimes deconstructing a fly or the materials that were used is not always a 100% guarantee that they're all going to be identical. Because as you pointed out early on, she was practical, could potentially have used different materials under different circumstances or based on the supply of materials at hand.
Right, absolutely. And, and the Hilliards are, when Leslie's dad was alive, they would be able to document the flies. They knew they had deconstructed a couple that were in rough shape that were donated to them. And they're the experts now on that. Peter Simonson has been really good about logging all the unknown named ones. And every time you think you got them all, somebody walks in and they have a different pattern that you've never seen before. And it's one that she tied. Like in that mix of the Polly Damon ones, there's several that don't have names. And the rest of them, we know what they are, but we don't know what those names are. And maybe somebody is watching this, has one at home, and it's in a card. It's got a name on it, and they want to let us know that they have it, and that'll be one more that we know.
Sure.
So that's really what we hope. Not only you learn how this fly is tied and a little history of it, but maybe it will stimulate somebody to go in the closet and say, "Oh yeah, my great grandfather had a bunch of her flies," and certainly some of them are still in the package. So.
Well, one thing I learned a long time ago is never say never. When you think that all of the patterns have been discovered, someone's going to turn up with something that was previously unknown. And of course, yourself and Peter were very helpful in identifying the materials used. One of the pieces that the museum has, of course, we've been talking about it quite a bit today. It's a map, a hand-drawn map that features a number of original Carrie Stevens flies. Peter,
it's a map of Rangeley,
yeah,
and the lake, and it's pencil, so it's faded, and the flies are stuck around it, and you can't really mess with them because the metal tinsel. You even look at it the wrong way, and it's just gonna fall apart.
Right.
And so Peter and I had magnifying glasses and lights, and we did the best we could. He's very good at the unknown ones, and we just went back and forth. And the dyes that they used on the wings have really these flies all fished. That was what made it even more difficult.
Sure.
They had all been fished, so they had been beat up. They had been probably stored in a fly wallet before they were placed on this, and once they were placed on it, no one messed around with them. So the wings are all in kind of wild gymnastic poses, but you can still see certain things. There were times when we looked at something and said, what is this hook? The hook was a different hook than she normally used. Okay, it was a Willis and Sons hook. That made sense. Sometimes we looked at it and said there's no black band on that, but then when we were able to look from one angle, we could see the black band underneath. It was because the lacquer had discolored so much.
Sure.
It had faded it. And it was great to have two eyes. And I'm sure if we brought Les up to look at them with us, he might be able to spot something we didn't. But it was a fun, couple hours going through those, and we did document them, and the museum has them. Come up and look at them.
The thing that's beneficial, of course, is you don't have to be a member to go on our online collections database. I encourage everyone to take a look at it. That Carrie Stevens map and those flies are available to anyone right now from the AMFF.org website. You can go to our collections tab and click on online collections. If you were to key in Carrie Stevens as a keyword, you'll be able to click on that record. That map will pop up and you'll see all the flies that we've been talking about. As I mentioned, we will add a photo to this webinar if you wanted to watch it again later. But what's most important to know is that you're able to go, you might want to wait until we're finished with the presentation, but you can go to amff.org, click on that online collections database, type in your keyword, in this case, Carrie Stevens, and you'll see all the examples that we currently have in the museum that are available for public viewing.
Yeah, and I want to add that just it's a small commercial because I've had the opportunity to do some articles for the journal, and for the membership price, and the journal itself is a really complete source of information. There's some really interesting articles to read about fishing and whatnot, but there's some deep down history researched by different authors, and it is really well put together. The editor is excellent, and everyone who writes for it is held to a really high standard, and it's worth it. And people who have read some of the recent things that we've contributed to have come back and said you're absolutely right. For the membership fee, the journal is really worth all that. But then you have, like, access to what we're sitting here that you can't see on the webinar, all the different materials, books and whatnot that are really cool.
Well, thank you. Yeah, of course, I'm biased. I agree. And if you're not a member, I certainly encourage you to become a member and support things like these webinars and some of the documentation that we provide, and of course preserving the history of the sport of fly fishing. So as always, Scott, thank you very much for coming in. Of course, I'm already looking forward to our next webinar. We have an interesting fly coming up. You want to go ahead and give them a teaser?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a teaser. It's great history, and we're working on an article about it. There was a fellow who was a architect in Canada named Percy Nobbs, and if you go to McGill University, he designed most of the buildings that are up there of the era that he was head of the architectural department. But he started the Atlantic Salmon Association, which is now the Atlantic Salmon Federation. And I'm telling you, you have this fly pattern, and I've looked at it every way to Sunday, and I've been able to reproduce it with the materials. And he's written a couple books. He was an amazing person. He was a silver medalist for fencing in the Olympics for Canada. But from everything we understand, he tied his own fly, and this is a pattern that we believe he tied. And I'm going to tie it. And I tied it at the Atlantic Salmon Federation meeting the other day, and there were a lot of people that were glued to what we were doing. It was kind of cool, because not all of them understood that he actually started their association. And when I mentioned that to some of these people, they were like, "Really? I didn't know that." And they obviously had immediate knowledge of but they didn't have all that, and it was really interesting to them So it was good, and somebody got one of them in the auction, so it was kind of cool.
Well, got a Scott Biron type example. We don't want people to think that
we're
giving away.
No, we're not giving that away.
So without giving out too much information, you now have a teaser and know what to look forward to with our next streamer time with Scott Biron. So again, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Scott, as always, it's a tremendous treat to watch you tie. And again, if you're not a member of the museum, certainly encourage you to take a look and certainly check out our online database. And we hope that you become a member. Thank you, everyone. Yeah. Oh.